So, Paul, thank you for joining me for this new season of the podcast. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. How are you doing today?
Oh, no, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to it.
Well, so before I kick off asking you about your book, I want to ask the question that I typically open these conversations with. And that's if we were to imagine that there is some kind of global human psyche, what do you sense or think is happening in that psyche right now?
Gosh, that's a difficult opener. I think, and it's one of the themes in the book, is that the connectivity between us and others and the external is much greater than many people, perhaps not listeners to this podcast, but many people realize. And it's sort of trying to explain the mechanisms by which that happens. So we're like a complex net, almost like a weather system where
Mm.
uh, there may be local storms, local happenings, but it reflects a much greater and broader interaction. So coming back to your question, it would then be in that lattice, that big complex net that we are in, that weather system, there are places of calm and joy, and there are places of storm at the moment
Mm.
as we read the news and see about the difficulties in various bits of the world, and at an individual and personal level, people who are at different trajectories.
Mm. Interesting, because literally, as you say this, I'm in Barcelona, and last night we got a severe weather warning, and basically the whole city has shut down because there is extreme wind ripping through the city. Um, and it got me thinking about this kind of, with weather systems, that we're often encouraged, certainly in Western societies, to consider our own weather systems as isolated pods. If you just do enough mindfulness, or if you just do enough work on yourself, or whatever it might be, that then it can kind of still the internal waters or winds, when actually we're not in isolation. And I wonder to what extent, and sort of we can bring this into your book as well, but to what extent this sort of myth of being in our own bubbles is helpful or hindering us when it comes to dealing with the challenges that we face today.
Yeah, it perhaps people beat themselves up too much because it's the balance between having a sense of agency, so you can
Mm.
affect change both in yourself and because we are so connected in other people and in society. So there are these complex interactions, but there are limits. And I suspect people do beat themselves up because they think, no, I'm trying to do these things. I'm trying to be mindful, yet I still have this distress.
Yeah.
And so if you can get a greater understanding of where we fit as individual beings in this bigger system, maybe then you can have more self-compassion,
Yeah.
which I think is really important.
So it's the perfect time to talk about your book, The Evolving Brain: How to Thrive in a World You Weren't Meant For. What moved you to write it, first of all? Because it feels very timely, especially as there's so much change happening at such a pace right now, even at the beginning of the year. What moved you to write the book?
Yeah, so it's been a very long journey. I mean, I went into medicine because of interest in the brain, and
Mm.
do I tackle those sort of big interests through the philosophy or physics route? And went for physicianry, thinking that there are fundamental constraints on our understanding which arise because of our brain. And so, if you
Mm.
can understand what the brain is trying to do, then you can better unlock some of these sort of big fundamental questions. And one key thing is that the brain sort of grows from inside outwards. It's a bit like a tree, that you've got the trunk that then has the branches and then the outer leaves. And that reflects the evolutionary underpinnings of, of the brain, of development. And those evolutionary underpinnings go back hundreds of millions, billions of years. And unless you understand that trajectory, that route, those underpinnings, you cannot really understand how we fit in this sort of very complex world. And I did my PhD in developmental biology, which is really the flip side of the coin to evolutionary medicine,
Mm.
the ontology and phylogeny, so the jargon for development and evolution. are effectively the same thing, just tackled from different routes. Development is a bit like the complexity sort of stripped away so you can see what those core drivers are. And they're so deeply embedded in us. If you think about the timelines of evolution, evolution took 2 billion years, 2,000 million years to perfect a single basic cell, and then another billion years to perfect a more complex cell. 500 million years for a worm. So a worm has got a lot of, that's when you get the brain emerging, because the brain is coordinating, it's optimizing function. 60 million years for primates, 5 million years for Homo genus, sapiens, a few 100,000 years. So in terms of that entire journey, we represent 0.01% of that entire evolutionary journey. So, like it or not, we've got this ancient tool which was optimized for the ancient environment. And within a couple of 100 years, even just decades, even months now with AI, we're seeing this massive, massive change in the external environment and this mismatch.
Yeah.
And so that creates many of the problems that we face in the modern world, both as individuals and in society. And I was seeing these problems every day in my clinic. I'm a practicing clinician as a neurologist, and I could help patients by bringing them some insights, some evolutionary insights. But I've only got a very limited time in clinic to do that. So I wanted to give a more structured view to people in a more leisurely time to explain what it was all about. But in particular, as well as the explaining, giving people actionable insights so they could really make a difference to their lives.
Mm. So one of the things I really like about your book, because if you're talking about evolution and development and neurology and the brain, these are very complex themes to communicate in a way that people can feel they have access to them. And one of the things that I love about your book, the tangibility of it, are the ways in which each chapter, most of the chapters, focus on specific aspects of the brain. So from the melancholic brain, I love that, to the egoless brain towards the end of the book. And I'm curious, what is it about looking at the brain through these different lenses that you think is really helpful for us in the modern world today?
Yeah, one of the biggest things that have been writing in the book was getting the ordering correct of the chapters,
Yeah.
because it is a very logical progression, and it's a evolutionary developmental progression of what is the absolute, what is the brain there? Why do we have a brain? Sort of beginning with that, and then what is the absolute core, the center of it, trying to do, and then just gradually layering it out, and doing it that way. Then it makes more sense to people when they're reading a later chapter. Okay, I understand why the brain is doing this because of earlier chapters. And I think it also then allows you to take the advice a bit better. And because some of the things that the very practical bits of advice, you say, oh yeah, no, I knew that, but now it makes more sense.
Yeah.
And if it makes more sense, then you're more likely to take on board the advice.
Yeah.
And equally, there are bits that we're told to do that probably are not helpful and don't make sense. And so you've then got this framework that you can apply to any aspect of life.
Mhm. So, what are some of the biggest challenges do you think we face, given that we are not necessarily evolved to deal with the hyper complexity, instability, and scale of the world that we live in? You know, access to all of this ever changing information and kind of systems beyond our localities. How do we deal with that?
Yeah. So step one is get the understanding. If you can understand why you're thinking a particular way, why you're getting distressed, then that is a big step towards uncoupling from it, and protecting yourself from it, and being able to make sensible changes to better cope. And perhaps sort of two broad themes which are sort of really important, are around goal directed behavior
Hmm.
and a successful achievement of goals, which is a fundamental, the fundamental thing for the brain. And then thinking, well, what are the specific goals that are being thrust upon us in modern life? And how has that changed compared to hundreds or thousands of years ago? And that's where a lot of the problems lie in the modern world.
So do you want to talk us through some of these goals? I remember last time we chatted, there were, it was quite revealing to think about the pain that we open ourselves up to, given the misfit between the ways in which we are taught, certainly in more capitalist societies, to aim for goals and fulfillment and the kind of promise of well, I don't know if we get promise of society, but the promise of success, let's say, and how that aligns with the goals versus actually what we've evolved to orient towards, and perhaps where we find the greatest fulfillment.
Yeah. So the latter bit is particularly around sort of social goals, which are so important as a social species. And given that our basic needs, our sort of Maslow's basic needs are met,
Hmm.
then social goals become absolutely critical and drive so much of what we do and unhappiness. But if we begin in terms of the understanding around, well, when you think what is the basic difference between a plant and an animal as a starting point, and some people say, "Oh, well, it's maybe photosynthesis,"
Mm.
when it's not, because perhaps not at the minute in the UK, maybe in Spain it's a bit different, but we do photosynthesize from sunlight. We make vitamin D in our skin. Um, uh, Perhaps people say, well, it's sort of the interaction with other organisms. Well, trees form complex structures through fungal networks under the ground.
Mm.
So the actual difference is movement.
Mm.
It's animals change location to move towards something which enhances their ability to survive. Because ultimately, our genes are only interested in one thing. It all comes down ultimately to persistence of information, of
Mm.
form, which means transferring our genes. And animals do this by moving successfully towards a goal, and the brain controls that movement process. So it is a goal direction tool, and it induces us towards moving towards a goal by making it rewarding. And dopamine is one of
Mm.
the important chemicals in that. Um, but nature never envisaged us being teleported towards the goal. It incentivizes us to do stuff to reach that goal. And so maximizing happiness involves that successful progression to the goal, not just the end receipt of it. So that brings us to sort of one of the problems in modern life, that we passively receive, or some people passively receive goals, and it short
Yeah.
circuits the envisioned process for our brains and deprives us of the opportunity for full happiness. And it's a difficult one from a societal perspective. How do you provide the necessary um, uh, support nets, the required welfare to underwrite problems
Mm.
without depriving people of meaningful goals? But the brain is always calculating, is this the right goal to go towards? Is it delivering what I expect, or should I shift to a different goal?
Mm.
Is If another organism does it better than you, you'll be outcompeted and you won't survive as a species. So the brain has got an accelerator and a brake. Um, so if you imagine how this might play out in an animal, a more simple animal, you've got a deer perhaps in winter. It's really hungry. It knows that there's some food a couple of valleys away. So it sets out because that's its goal, and it's being
Mm.
drawn towards that goal. But the weather closes in, the ground is really swampy, and so it's making really slow progress. It's starting to hear some noises of a potential predator. The brain is constantly making this calculation. Am I successfully moving towards the goal, or is the cost too high?
Mm.
And if the cost is too high, it signals disengage from the goal. No, go back to base
Yeah.
and wait, or take up a different goal. That disengagement is associated with that's sort of where sort of the sense of melancholy comes in. So
Mm.
melancholy is a brain tool to encourage us to disengage from what is perceived to be an unsuccessfully pursued goal. That would happen very, very quickly in ancient times. We disengage, we then move towards another goal, and the goals would be foraging, building
Mm.
a nest. They're sort of simple, fairly short term, predictable goals. The big change in modern life is literature has evolved to provide this external memory system, which allows this enormous accumulation of knowledge and complexity of goals, which are thrust upon us by parents, peers, and the media, the external world. And modern goals play out not over minutes or hours or days, they're over years or
Mm.
decades. They don't provide the regular feedback, or we're getting feedback that we're not achieving the goals, the career progression, the new title, the house, the various sort of attributes that we are told that we should have. That way we get messages that we're not succeeding. And so our brain is very simple. It's just got that accelerator and brake. And instead of the disengagement, we're ending up with the accelerator and brake both applied at the same time
Mm.
because of this sort of complex, long-term, very abstract, non-physical goals. And so it's not surprising that we have an endemic of melancholy and not being given that fuel of well-being, of a good feeling from the successful goal pursuit that would have happened in ancient times. I think that is a
Yeah.
really sort of important core understanding to have. And then you sort of then can then expand on, well, actually, what are these complex goals? And I've touched on them a little bit, but perhaps we then expand on the social side, which is so important and brings so much unhappiness
Mm.
in modern life.
There are so many directions that I want to go in from what you just described. Maybe I'll pick a couple and then we can go from there. It's very interesting to hear you talking at the start of this response about the drive towards the propagation of one's genes, and how in modern society, especially as a woman, I am so often grateful for the fact that I have a degree of intellectual sovereignty over my body, so I can make a decision as to whether or not to propagate my genes. And that is a huge source of freedom and joy and release to me personally. And I know that when one doesn't have that, it can be also a deep source of anguish to not be able to propagate one's genes, to have children, to have family. But I'm curious about people who, excuse me, people who choose either not to have children or have no drive to have children or choose to engage in a different way in the world. Or, for instance, I'm thinking about monastics from Plum Village that I've mentioned a couple of times on the podcast, people who dedicate their lives to perhaps creating changes within the social web that you talked about at the beginning, without it being something that they are physically manifesting a new human being into, but there are other ways in which to influence the social net or the field or whatever. Um, whether it's a peace march through the United States and people showing up for specific values, or it might be artists who decide to create their life's work, however large or small, in a way that supports the accompaniment of people through a beautiful song at their moment of grief, or whatever it might be. And so I'm curious, how does that show up? How do you make sense of that in your research, where some people are driven from a deep place to live in a way that doesn't propagate their genes?
Yeah, so it's asking the why repeatedly. So why this? Why? And
Yeah.
okay, so if that's the case, then why that second reason? And if you drill back, ultimately,
Mm.
it does come down to persistence of form. So what's the basic difference between what is life? And a rock persists because it's very stable. The
Mm.
structure is stable. So that structure from a billion years ago is still there now for us to look at in a cliff because of its stability. When life was dialed up, from that primitive soup, it was sort of very fragile structures, but structures which could create complexity. So you've both got complexity and fragility at the same
Mm.
time. And unless you've got that replication of form, then the fragile structure disappears and you don't have that maintenance. So, like it or not, it does come down to the genes view that the genes have have spooled up a toolkit to ensure their propagation. And that toolkit includes basic emotions like happiness, sadness, melancholy, we've talked about already, anger, guilt, shaming, things which are very important and go awry in modern life. Um, the desire to have sex.
Mm.
So we why do people go through the act of sexual intercourse? I mean, in some ways you think, what a ridiculous thing for two organisms to do. It's such a strange thing. Our genes have given us the reward to do it because it serves a purpose.
Yeah.
Now, because we've got so much complexity in our brains now, some of the goals that we pursue can nullify some of the others, or they can suppress them. But at the core, it still comes down to propagation of genes at the core.
So I'm curious about what you make of the declining fertility rates and birth rates, and whether, because I think that there's a connection there between insecurity about one's sense of the future and it being something that is expansive and has potential for beauty and well-being and growth and development, and sort of that fear being certainly among many of my friends. I know a lot of people who are kind of in their 30s, many of whom would otherwise like to have children, who are electing not to because of the context we find ourselves in. And these are in peaceful nations that aren't yet having to deal with national security issues around food scarcity or water scarcity or um, violence or anything like this. What's your sense there about, some of the complex systems that we've created because of our evolutionary prowess or what have you, perhaps are now contributing to the atrophy of global population? I wonder what your thoughts might be on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know whether there's a parallel with just sort of biology in terms of population density of any animal, which is normally it reaches a peak
Mm,
and balances against food availability.
yeah.
So there is this sort of natural tension that happens in ecology, and so one argument might be that the food, if you like, that the nutrition that we are seeking, rather than just being food, which would be for most animals now, it is housing, career. So these other goals,
Hmm.
the complex goals that we're told that we need to pursue, that are seeded as important things in our lives, which then suppress uh, that conflict of having children. It is a really difficult thing.
Fascinating. Um, okay, so thinking about the mesh and about society and social needs and melancholy, and you mentioned this endemic of melancholy. What's your sense about what's going on there You know, why is it the case that so many people are feeling disengaged, lonely, isolated? What's your read on that?
Uh, so we too many people either don't have appropriate goals which provide regular feedback which are achievable. So we need
Hmm.
we need to be doing stuff that we can successfully achieve, and on a regular basis we're getting signals that that we're moving towards that goal. So um, you've got to do stuff. It's really important to have projects. Retirement often brings unhappiness because people think, oh, it's just, I'm so sort of sick of all of this, I'm just going to stop and go on a cruise. And it doesn't work. It makes them miserable. So in these sort of life-changing things, it should be transition rather than stopping. So structure your life with achievable goals, but also appraise and think, actually, am I achieving them? So maybe you're sort of feeling that you're not, but you're just not getting appropriate feedback, or you're not
Hmm.
perceiving it in the right way. So you can alter the way that you think about goals. But sometimes you've got to give up on goals. And that can be really releasing. You mentioned about childbirth, and it is a very rational and entirely appropriate and should be supported thing for many women never to want to have children. That's
Hmm.
very reasonable. But there are some who are really distressed because they want children and can't have them.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, if you follow them up, when they go through the menopause, their mood improves
Hmm.
because they've got a forced release of goal. They just can't do it now.
Yeah.
That's the striving, the struggle is over. And I see it also when some people are diagnosed with a terminal condition.
Hmm.
There's great sadness, but also this sort of goal release. Okay, I don't have to deal with all of this crap anymore.
Yeah.
It's over. So it's been very strategic in your goal setting, but there is a lot of loneliness as well, and social media, I think, has a role to play. I think there's hope was 20 years ago that
Hmm.
we'd all be happier because we'd be more connected. The brain can only handle a certain number of relationships, meaningful relationships. The Dunbar number of 150, and Robin Dunbar's arguments that one of the key differentiators of sapiens was our ability to coordinate a larger group than other species and therefore outcompete them. But that is around 150 people. But
Hmm.
actually, if you look at his work, he talks about the inner circles of relationships, and the most important are your core, your really core group, your shoulders to cry on. So people who would drop everything if you were in trouble,
Yeah.
uh, and that number correlates really well with your well-being, your survival from cancer or cardiovascular disease, your overall fatality rate. And the target might be 3 to 5 people. Many people have none. They might
Wow.
have loads of people that they interact with on LinkedIn or on lots of friends on Facebook, but they're not. What you need is that consistent, reliable, small group of really good friends.
Yeah.
And the way we live our modern lives actually means that there's an opportunity cost. So you've got to allow enough time and create the right environment for those stable, meaningful relationships, and not dilute it with superficial. No,
Yeah.
superficial relationships, fine. It can be useful for career and so on, but not at the expense of having your core group.
Hmm.
And that's ultimately, it's just another goal. So if you're not succeeding in having those meaningful relationships with reciprocity, then your brain is going to be signaling not achieving goal and getting the melancholy again.
Hmm. It's funny, one of the things that is such an unsexy, uninspiring answer to so many of these issues that I keep returning to is scheduling in time for the things that you most deeply love. And literally, it's that basic, and it's so basic. Things like, you know, especially when there's so much going on, and I work kind of fairly independently. And so no 2 weeks look the same, basically. But within the sort of rhythm of my month or whatever, there are specific people that I will see every single week at a particular time, even if it's for a coffee for an hour before work starts, just to be in connection with those people. Or if I'm back in London, people that I will always call upon. Um, and it just means that you're creating that container within which you just get to root in with that person. And it's that kind of decision to, I think of it almost like, you mentioned the stability of rocks earlier, which I really loved. And I often think of this in terms of life almost like a river. And you can put rocks in it in specific places around which the river flows. And for me, these relationships are like this, like these glistening, beautiful, sturdy rocks that you place in the river of life and time, so that as things flow around them, they're there for the time that they exist, you know. But I'm wondering if there are any other strategies. You mentioned earlier about the goals that society or our families might offer us and say, look, this is what success looks like, or what a life well lived might look like. In your experience with the research of your book and all of your clinical work, what are the things that give people the goals or the ways of conceiving of themselves in the world that give people the greatest long-term, not happiness, but meaning and belonging? Because I think happiness is something that can be like those weather systems. The sun can come and go behind clouds. It's accessible, but it's not always there, visible to
Yeah,
the human eye.
it is. It is the stable relationships with reciprocity in your core group. I mean, that
Mm.
is so important. It, in ancient times, if you were excluded from the group, you die.
Yeah.
It is just so important, and we crave. We seek validation. We seek the signals from others that we are accepted into the group as a very core need. And then laid on top of that, we want to be not just accepted into the group, but we want to be ranked as highly as possible within the group in terms of
Mm.
how important we are regarded, because that probably gave you better access to food and in times of great hunger. So there's one video which is really worth watching. If you've never seen it, the Edtronic silent face video, it's sort of 2 minutes long, quite an old video now. I mean, it's fantastic. So if I can try and describe it, has a mother and a baby. The baby can't speak yet. It sort of makes various sounds, playing with the mum, and the mum looks away and then turns back and she's got a blank face. Not a scowly face, just a blank face.
Yeah.
And the baby initially sort of bit of surprise and then puts more energy. So the baby starts to work
Oh,
harder to get the mum to respond again.
respond.
And then the mum's still got the blank face. So the adrenaline kicks into the baby and the baby gets angry and starts to have a bit of a tantrum and throws things out of its chair, and then gets really upset and starts to cry. And then your heart is breaking at that stage. The
No.
mum breaks and cuddles the baby again. That you see every day in adult life. So the theatre is different, the script is different, but the plot line is the same for us as adults. You look at politicians who get
Mm.
so upset because they haven't been made a lord, or David Beckham has been knighted now, but previously he was overlooked and got really upset about it. You think this guy's got absolutely everything, is
Mm.
so successful, more than any of us could imagine, but as are many politicians, but they still get so upset. And it's just the same. Do they love me?
Yeah.
We all just want that that validation and that signaling. But modern life has made it an arms race, and it's exploited. And this is where one of the tensions happens, that and houses of parliament or other political institutions have evolved, cleverly. So evolution is not is not necessarily nice. It just means what's most successful.
Hmm.
So it uses the throwing of baubles or the offering of honours to people to induce them to behave a particular way.
Hmm.
But it causes great upset in them because they're not immediately getting them. There's the same with salary. The executives getting so upset because somebody else is being paid 2 million, they're only being paid 1.5 million. I mean, it's nuts. But they're just sort of viewing it relatively. We're in this arms race. The Napoleon, he exploited it. He said, a soldier will do anything for a bit of coloured ribbon. We just crave that. So you've got societal structures which exploit this need we've got. Venture capital as well. So that it helps motivate people to do things that they might not other do. They sort of slave away at the lab or at work or in politics, desperate to get this recognition. So that helps progress, making new stuff, inventing stuff. Good for society, arguably, for the individual, not. So
Yeah.
one of the things is sort of thinking, hang on, I'm being played here. The society is playing me. I might still decide to engage with the game, but I'm going to do it on my terms, so I don't suffer as an individual.
So I'm curious what that can look like. I'm thinking particularly just because Lionel Messi, I don't know if you've seen him play when he played for Barcelona, but he had so much going against him, really short player. He's now in his latter 30s and is still absolutely tearing it up. But also someone who seems, for all intents and purposes, to have a stable life with a partner that he's been with for years and a family that he adores. And just there is something about the focus with which he plays football that the game is the thing and that everything else can just fuck off. And there's something so deeply liberating about seeing someone who is at the pinnacle, adored by Argentina, adored by people all over the world, who has such a deep love for the game. And I don't know if actually he has been diagnosed as having autism. There's been speculation around maybe he has, maybe he's neurodivergent and is able actually to just, through the functioning of his brilliance and passion, to have this particular type of focus that means that other things are less salient, and what a liberation that might be, and the pleasure that he takes in being able to focus in the way that he does. And anyway, so I'm curious about so there's a couple of questions bound up in here. So one is around the role perhaps of neurodivergence in being less snagged or hooked by some of these other things that many of us just respond to without necessarily even wishing to. And then what we might learn to be able to unsnag ourselves. You mentioned, how can we play our own game to look at the context, understand the dynamics, and make different choices?
Yeah. No, there's a lot in there.
That's a lot.
People who can in their keep through physical means, I think, have got a big advantage, because mostly sort of the brain envisaged goal reward through movement. And so physical activity is one of the best ways of, and it's a very reliable and predictable. You're running to a target. Okay, I'm going to go for a 30-minute run. So you've got a goal of completing the run, but you've also got a goal of getting to the end of the road, and then you've got the sub goal of reaching each lamppost, or each swing of the leg is a sub goal of a sub goal. So it's a very reliable way of bringing a good flow of dopamine and well-being. You can do that in a football match where you've got a crowd cheering you. I mean, that's just fantastic. Compared to if you happen to be less intelligent in terms of your foot motor control, but are, inverted commas, gifted in terms of ability to do maths, something cognitive. You're then going to end up channeled down a path in life that is more likely to have long-term, harder to achieve, more in a different way, competitive. So that a lot of the path dependency we've got in terms of, why am I so hung up about achieving X? If you can trace it back, actually, you've got these sort of key influences when you were a child,
Mm.
and then as a teenager, that you may long be forgotten, that have maybe given you an advantage, but maybe have burdened you with goal expectation. So trying to, again, it's sort of self-compassion. It's not my fault that I inherited particular genes or a particular postcode or particular parents and happen to end up with certain peers, that have just loaded my brain with these expectations of what success in inverted commas looks like for me.
So if someone wanted to do, like, listening to this, an audit somehow without having access to these early memories, and it's hazy, and they're just like, what on earth am I doing? And there's this classic, um, not for everybody for sure, but a classic developmental stage of around the age of 40-ish. People often coming to this. I guess for some it can be as severe as like an initiatory precipice where you peer over the ledge and you think, oh my God, what am I doing with my life? What goals am I working towards? Do they resonate with something deeper within me? Where do I find my meaning? Like, how can people listening to this thinking, actually, I'd like to audit the goals that I'm striving for and whether they are in alignment with some deeper sense of purpose and gratification. What techniques have you found helpful in your client work, your clinical work?
Yeah, it, it, it's getting people to have the right balance.
Mhm,
So in general, you want to do as much as possible in the various core sort of physical, social, mental. So having the mix, making sure that they are stretch but achievable,
mhm,
reliable feedback. So particularly focus on the social, um, and not conflicting. So not so many that they actually interfere with each other and you don't achieve anything. And then adapt them to your situation. And your situation changes with age and you're less capable of things. The Lionel Messi is not worth as much on the transfer market now as he was when he was 20.
yeah.
Um, like it or not, we do change in terms of our capabilities, but it doesn't matter. Whatever they are, you just work towards the outer edge of those, and make it achievable.
So in
And
terms of
then I've
things
got,
like, yeah, go on.
yeah, and I've got sort of fantastic patients. Is one of the joys of being a clinician, who really take that on board and are inspiring in terms of what they do. And it's the only case in the book where I haven't anonymized the patient, and Bob, who's right at the very end, who I diagnosed with Parkinson's in his late 70s.
Mm,
And we sort of explain some of these sort of concepts and just really encouraged to just do it. And you
mm.
can. And in his 80s, he whitewater rafted in the Himalayas. He cross country
Wow.
skied in Antarctica. He just did loads, and then he got worse. He
Yeah.
gradually, and he always looked to change his environment a little bit ahead of what he needed to do. So he moved into a bungalow before he lost the ability to get upstairs. And part of that was so he could embed himself in a new social environment. So again, thinking you've got to
Mm,
have your core friends. So yeah, of course he's worse. I've seen him recently. He's in his early 90s now and has got a Zimmer. But so inspirational. I mean, what a
mm.
life. So, you can do loads.
I think it's also that kind of mindset shift, because I think one of the things that's the most insidious, certainly now, is a sense of kind of learned helplessness or apathy, or what could I possibly do? Um, and there's something about, well, I'll give an example. It sounds a bit odd, but I think also this idea of the I being a very small I, the individual, as opposed to the I embedded within the we, the wider world. I recently had, at the end of last year, the opportunity to give a talk at the World Business Forum in Madrid. and two of the big kind of superstars of psychology were speaking, Brené Brown and Adam Grant. And I've been thinking for several years how to integrate some of the things I really love, the art and the music, the creativity, and gathering people together into this professional business context, which is all about, or predominantly about, performance, efficiency, optimization. How can you get better and make more money, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, and so I was thinking about this, and I've been thinking a long time with this podcast and other things about, back to the top of our conversation today, about this way in which we are all interconnected, and that if we can find ways to change the thread of, or like the fabric of connection in which we sit, that it can impact the whole, that then feeds back and continues to impact. There's kind of some ripple effect. And I see this happen all the time in gigs and music. It's a very living, breathing version of this when it happens. And so at this event, I was absolutely bricking it. At the end of this talk, I was talking about AI and empathy and human connection and creativity and these sorts of dynamics and blind spots. And anyway, and at the end of it, I was talking about daring to be present, that it's very easy to passively receive content or to vibe code with very little input or knowledge, which is, fine, but then obviously within a wider context to sort of consider it more broadly. And so that one of the things that we can do that is most radical now is to dare to be present, to take risks in the presence of others, unmediated by technology. I mean, obviously there's a microphone, but advanced technologies, let's say. And so then I got this room of 1,300 business people to sing with me. And it's this kind of, I write folk music, and this particular one it's like a love letter to the world. It's this invocation of nature, which I love. Very simple. And I got them to sing this bit underneath, this harmony, and I sang on top, shaking like a leaf because it's not my context. And it was extraordinary. The number of women who came up in person afterwards, but then men who reached out on LinkedIn to say, I felt so alone and isolated. And then just hearing all these voices sing around me, I realized I'm not alone anymore. And this is one tiny moment. It lasted no more than a few minutes. And this is not a song that they're necessarily ever going to sing again or remember, but just the act of being in this sort of context where it's unexpected, to sing with other people just for a split second, to dare to be present. And it was this really vibrant moment where we all took a risk, and it was powerful. And it doesn't have to be professional or but there's something about that I think you're not.
It's supported by research, and Robin Dunbar will say, to improve your well-being, one of the best things you can do is join a choir.
Oh.
And in fact, sort of more broadly, religion. And it's because of the social net that you have.
And the consistency. You're regularly meeting people in communities, singing together over.
And the singing and the being part of this sort of bigger thing, and the echoing as well. So we talked about validation and status before. Below that is how profoundly we are a copying species. Some of that I think connects with the music bit, but we are very influenced by everything around us, but conversely we are influencers by everything we do, and there are these complex ripple effects.
Yeah, I think especially radical is kind of to be able to create or cultivate moments of connection, belonging, and refuge when there's so much instability and flux. But again, this myth of I have to do it alone, we can't. We can have a personal practice, but I think beyond that.
So engineer your life as an individual, or if you are in a position to do it more societally, to facilitate and encourage these sorts of meaningful group interactions. So I'll give it an example.
Yeah.
Where I used to live was on an unadopted road, which meant the residents had to look after the road.
Right.
And the mud and leaves would come across the field and block the drains. So every twice a year, we'd organise to go out on a Saturday morning and dig out the drains, sweep the leaves, and the youngsters would do some of the harder work. And you'd chat as you're doing it, and at the end, the elderly would have made the tea and cakes. And the conversations that were had provided inoculation against potential fights over hedge heights or whatever, neighbours end up bickering about. And once the new chair of the road society, happened to be an accountant, said, great news, I've spoken to the council and they've got this big machine that can come around and just
Oh,
spit it all up. And it's only going to be £50. I said, no, that's a terrible idea.
yeah.
And it's a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. So it would have been more efficient in terms of clearing, but you would have lost all of that social cohesion.
Yeah.
So you've got to, and maybe sport is a bit like that as well. What's the purpose of running around a football pitch? And the team element. So being involved in those sorts of activities, or an army unit, some of the most reliable long-term friendships
Mm.
are from the army, the army units, because they faced adversity and supported each other, and that lasts decades.
Mm.
So, and I'm not wanting to encourage wars, but
Mm.
it's how do you tap into that core psychology?
Yeah. And I think there is something about, I was talking about this with a couple of friends recently, that, when people go through really difficult periods, or not even necessarily massively difficult periods, like we moved flat 2 years ago, and in the move, we had to move out so that someone could move in. And we had a deadline and renovations, and the flat wasn't ready to move into. So then friends of ours just were like, come and stay with us. And it was supposed to be for 2 weeks. And then it was just so joyful that we stayed for an extra week. And then we stayed in our friend's studio. And it was this sense of, from this sense of, what we're going to do, we don't have a home right now to sleep in, to there's a net that's going to catch you. And then, or for instance, if one of them, one of my friends went through a really painful split, and it's the ways in which people just showed up for this person, and often it's that adversity that we
I
try
love
to
it.
keep at bay
Yeah.
that actually deepens the connections. Yeah.
Yeah, so you want to support, and that will have a cascade effect, because
Yeah.
then those individuals are more likely to do it for somebody else, and you get this upward spiral. The challenge, I think, is, so modern society and the welfare state can sometimes go from providing that safety net to providing everything, and it's like that sort of council machine to suck up the leaves.
Hmm.
If it does everything, and if we just remove all opportunity for meaningful social interaction, you've done people a disservice. There was a
Yeah.
thing when I was writing a particular chapter, an outcry, because I think it was Cornwall Council were removing the Meals on Wheels service
Hmm.
there, and they said, no, don't worry, because they won't go hungry. I thought, well, no, it's not the food that's the issue. It's the meaningful interaction that
Yeah.
they have, that people supporting each other.
But again, it's this very material problem solution, linear uh, perspective, I think, that leads to these sorts of optimized situations where you're actually optimizing for one problem and creating a whole web of other problems. It's curious because here, for instance, in Barcelona, there are so many festivities. Every month there's something going on, and there's a real orientation towards, I guess, sort of shared social spaces. And at the moment, being February, there's this thing called the calzotada, and calzots are these, they're kind of like leaks, and they whole communities come together and close off roads, and it's often the people who are older who will take care of, having on this massive grill all these calzots, these leeks to grill, and then they'll have an extended table, and they'll put paper posters up. I love that it's all offline, up on the street, so that you can, with the dates, and you pay like €10 or something. It's a feast. It's a really good value for money. And you show up and you sit on this table with all of your neighbors. We've yet to do it because we're usually traveling, but it's the fact that it happens, and it happens every single year. Or the correfox, which is basically when people are chased, limited health and safety, chased down the streets multiple times a year if you choose to show up by guys and girls and women and men of varying different ages with drums and fireworks into a plaza that then has massive bonfires that are sort of moderately guarded by rails by the council. But the emphasis is on people looking after everyone's kids and people looking after everyone's welfare together. Like you can, roasting sausages in the fire. It's great. But it always makes me think, there's an element of risk. You can get a hot rock in your clothing and it can burn you. The little ones always wear goggles and, but the older ones, they're going to get some burns. And I'm not sort of condoning that everyone should go, but it's that. It's like, yeah, but everyone comes together. And there's a sense of being safe within the community, or like, you go to, there's so many different park and play areas. If any child falls over, some adult near the child will pick them up, brush them down, make sure they're okay. Can you imagine that happening in the UK? Hands off my child. It's like, and actually it's funny. I was in the UK a while ago. My brother has two sort of boys, 10 and 8. And we were in a park, it was last summer, and someone else's kid had fallen over. And I went to pick them up. And my brother's like, don't do that. And it was just my heart clenched. And I was like, but this kid is just, he's like, we're not in Spain. And it was just this heart-dropping moment of just, I don't know, of not being able to respond in a
Yeah.
way that was
Yeah.
loving. And I know why, but
It is, you're spot on. Things have become optimized for the wrong, or for an understandable reason, but
yeah,
actually the secondary effects are so negative.
yeah,
So I like to think about paleopolitics. So part of this book, actually, although sort of for the individual, but the cascade, and that's what I really like about your thinking, because you think about the sort of the big sort of net picture. That we need to enlighten the policymakers, the politicians, to design things that are more attuned to the way our brains actually work rather than the way they would like them to work.
hmm,
We're stuck with our ancient tool.
yeah,
And one of those is around parenting. And there's a concept called alloparenting. And if you go to hunter-gatherer tribes, if you look at the number of interactions with different people of a child, it's with a whole group. So there's less time than in modern society between mum and child, but much more with the bigger group. And the duration of time a child is distressed before it is comforted is
yeah,
far less there than it is in the modern world.
yeah.
And you sort of think, we've got all of these sort of people who are really lonely, who are more elderly. We've got sort of problems in terms of child rearing, and there's a sort of potential solution here
Yeah.
that is sort of staring us in the face.
But wasn't there was a trial that was done a few years ago with primary school, very, very young, or maybe it was younger than primary school, like toddler age kids, and an elderly care home, and bringing them together. Did you read
Yeah,
about that? And everyone
yeah,
benefits. It was
that's
just,
right. Yeah,
it's like, well, yeah, I don't know. It just seems like the more isolated we become and the more stratified generationally, the worse things get.
yeah,
Just as a
yeah.
general rule of thumb, not to oversimplify things. So we're coming to time. Before I close, I wonder if there's one question or idea you'd really like people to reflect on, either from your book or from your current thinking and focus.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we haven't talked about, and it's a difficult concept, but
Mm.
perhaps for your podcast, it does chime, is the egoless brain.
Oh, yes, I had this in my question. We didn't get. Yeah, go on, please.
Because the one picture that I love the most about the book, and I can't quite see it, is hanging up on the wall, it's of a brain with a mask overlaid on it, sort of slightly transparent, so you can look through the mask at the brain. And it's because beauty is, what we perceive as beauty is basically the average of what we've been exposed to through our life.
Hmm.
Um, and I think so. The subtitle of the image is something like, "I am the average of what you call of what you call, or the average of what you call beauty is sitting behind my mask," or something. So the point I'm trying to make is that we perceive and interact with this face, which how much we like it is just a reflection of our personal history. But actually, what are we interacting with? Because many people, when they're asked that question, they say, well, I think the driver behind the wheel, the I, the ego,
Hmm.
is 5 centimeters behind the top of my nose. That's sort of where it is. Or maybe it's a bit more diffuse, but that's where it is. And then they say, well, hang on, look at the anatomy. And where does the visual pathway run? Because if you look at an MRI scan, there's nothing there. There's a bit of fluid and some crossing wires, but there's no driver there. And vision is processed right at the back of the head. But that could, if the brain developed in a slightly different way, that could be displaced to lower in the skull. I mean, it could theoretically be in your neck. You know,
Hmm.
are you going to perceive you as there? Or when you're reading and that's all processed on the the side of the and the temple, that's not where you think it's happening. So when you realize that, if you can get real insight into that, you and start to appreciate that actually it's a totality of neural activity within our skull rather than a specific individual, that then leads you to being able to uncouple, to dissociate in a controlled way from the sense of ego. And if you can do that, that's immensely powerful, particularly if you can do it to other people. So in meditation, in advanced meditation, you sometimes sort of taught sort of observe the observer. So
Hmm.
there's that step of just observing the thoughts, disconnecting from it, which is really good. But then you can actually observe the observer or listen to the listener and get a sense that it is just a totality. There's not a specific person. But you can also do that to other people. You can, and that's where I like that image. You can look through the mask, that average, and look at the totality within their brain. And then you start to realize we are part of this more complex net and dissolve. And that is really liberating. You've got to use it sort of tactically.
Hmm.
We've got to function in the modern world and be egos. Know the ego sense of ego is useful,
Hmm.
but just sort of opening up that valve tactically. And I try to lead people on that journey. That is the culmination of the journey. And a lot of chapters of the book is a complicated concept, but if you can get it, it's wonderful.
That's beautiful. Landing on the note of into being.
Yes.
So to finish, I'd love to ask you, how do you orient towards life and beauty when things are challenging or painful?
Just what I've said, actually, it is by the controlled uncoupling, by uh, the realization that we are part of this complex journey, products of hundreds of generations of knowledge, and this complex net of everything we've been exposed to, that there is this wave, and that I, as an individual, is in many ways, a delusion.
Hmm.
And being able to say, just dissolve that a little bit, times of distress, or dissolve it as when I'm perceiving other people who are being angry with me, threatening or whatever, is understanding what is happening within their skull and viewing it like a weather system. I don't get angry when the storm soaks me. I see
Hmm.
it as part of this complex net of of evolving patterns, and us as complex individuals are basically that sort of a similar process.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was such a joy talking with you.
Likewise, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.